Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth DeFazio and I worked in Dr. Bertuccio's lab group this semester to develop an at-home lab experiment focused on emulsions for process engineering lab senior year. Now, I worked on this specific research because emulsions are something that comes up in a variety of industries. So emulsions form by mixing two immiscible liquids in a way that allows for one to become finely dispersed in another. And industries from consumer goods, cosmetics, food, pharmaceuticals, and oil and gas all incorporate emulsions into their everyday operations. But there's currently no required course to teach students about what an emulsion is and how it's impacted by different variables. So this lab is intended to be incorporated in process engineering lab to teach students these underlying principles. Like I said, oil and water are agitated to form an emulsion. And as you can see here, little oil droplets are dispersed all throughout the water layer. And to stabilize an emulsion, typically surfactants are used. A surfactant is an amphiphilic molecule with a hydrophilic head group and a hydrophobic tail group, pictured below. And when a surfactant is added to a mixture, it lowers the interfacial tension between the oil and water layers, and that's what allows the oil to become finely dispersed within the water. There are two main mechanisms for stabilization using a surfactant. The first being an ionic surfactant uses the negative charges to repel away from one another using electrostatic repulsion. So these molecules don't want to get close to one another, they are going to repel, and that's what keeps the oil dispersed throughout the water. The second mechanism is stabilization due to steric hindrance. In this case scenario, there are non-ionic surfactants with very large head groups, and these head groups can't get within a certain distance of one another, and this keeps the oil molecules dispersed in water. For my individual experiments, I would agitate the oil and water mixture and begin to time out how long it took for the emulsion to actually separate out. And I would take corresponding height values at these times to see whether I had 1 milliliter of water separation, 4, 5, etc. Pictured below, you can see an oil and water mixture before agitation, and the oil layer is very distinctly separated from the water. In the second photo, there's an oil and water mixture after 10 minutes. So the emulsion is still present, but you can clearly see that a water layer has begun to separate out. In the final picture, there is an oil and water mixture with 3 milliliters of isopropyl alcohol. And this picture was taken 40 minutes after agitation, and no water layer was visible. This is how I ran my tests, and I was able to very clearly see how stable an emulsion is by how long it took the water layer to actually separate out. The three experiments that I really focused on are pictured here. And the first one, I looked at how vigorous agitation could increase emulsion stability. So I prepared each emulsion a little differently. In red, I just gently shook the container. In green, I shook vigorously for 10 seconds. And in blue, I shook vigorously for 20 seconds. And what I found is shaking vigorously for a prolonged period of time had the best emulsion stability and allowed the particles to be more finely dispersed in one another. The next variable I looked at was temperature dependence to see whether this could impact emulsion stability. And I used one emulsion at room temperature as my baseline. And then in green, I used distilled water that was near freezing temperatures in my container to actually have a cold liquid as part of the emulsion. In my third experiment, pictured in red, I used an ice bath. So I did the baseline measurements and I used room temperature water, but I submerged the emulsions into a ice cold bath. And what I found was that there wasn't a significant difference in any of these tests. Very slightly colder temperatures seemed to increase emulsion stability, but the emulsions did separate out pretty quickly, and it's hard to compare those results. So I'd like to continue studying the effects of temperature next semester. Finally, I used isopropyl alcohol as a co-solvent in my emulsion. And what I found is that the more isopropyl alcohol I used, the more stable the emulsion turned out to be. The yellow circles are the baseline test with no co-solvent, and the blue squares are when I used 3 milliliters of the alcohol. And as you can see, the emulsion lasted over an hour with no separation. So it's clear that using alcohol as a co-solvent increased emulsion stability for prolonged periods of time. In conclusion, different preparation methods, temperatures, and using a co-solvent can all demonstrate different impacts on emulsion stability. And these are all different variables that can be changed and used with one another to see how emulsions react. I think because of the number of variables that are used, students can definitely test this at an at-home or in lab environment and get real measurable results and start to understand the principles that go with emulsion stability, and they can apply that to industry. So I think that's really awesome. And I just wanted to say thank you. This research has been generously supported by the Department of Chemical and Biochemical Engineering at Rutgers, as well as the Byrne Foundation. So thank you so much for listening.